Good evening. Warm welcome to everyone. It's a great pleasure to introduce Ronald Hawker, who I'm sure is well known to most people in our audience today from his time in the UAE, although he has now become an apple farmer in eastern Canada, nevertheless. He's the author of the popular blog, Digital Heritage in the UAE, at rhawker.me. We already knew Ron from his time in the UAE, as I just said, but it was this recent blogging activity that captured our attention and prompted our invitation for him to speak at NYUAD. He's a unique and special resource, that is rhawker.me, but he is also, well, it makes sense that the owner of the resource should be a resource himself. Sorry if that doesn't make sense. Dr. Hawker was most recently Associate Chair of the School of Critical and Creative Studies at the Alberta College of Art and Design in Calgary, Canada, and an Associate Professor in the Department of Art and Design at Saeed University in Dubai, in the UAE, where he taught from 1999 to 2011. He is originally from Canada and has a BA, or Bachelor of Arts, and a Master of Arts degree in History in Art from the University of Victoria, and a PhD in Art History from the University of British Columbia. He has taught as an adjunct lecturer at the American University of Sharjah, at the University of British Columbia, the University of Manitoba, Douglas College, Capilano College, and the Emily Carr Institute of Art and Design. It's quite a list. He has published 2 books, Tales of Ghosts, First Nations Art in British Columbia from 1922 to 1961, and traditional architecture in the Arabian Gulf, Building on Desert Tides, which was published in 2008. His book on the Kwak totem pole carver Charlie James, entitled Yakugla's Legacy, The Art and Times of Charlie James, will be published by the University of Toronto later this year. Please welcome Ron Hawker.
Wow, this is amazing being here, I gotta tell you. And I was getting really nervous when I saw how many people were coming in. I feel pressured now. The fact that you mentioned the blog as the reason for coming here is amazing to me. I'm sitting at home behind my computer thinking that there's only 12 people that ever look at it, so it's a really nice thing to hear. I actually wanted to just, this is the way it's going to work. I'm going to try and talk for about 50 minutes or so. And the first part of that, I'm going to sort of meander around what I've been doing, and then I'm going to pull that together and talk more specifically about historic UAE architecture. I'm going to take one type of house, and I'm comparing it with some modern iconic architecture. And I kind of want to ask the question is, why do we choose to, particularly to teach, because I think ultimately when everything is brought together, this is one of the great passions for me, was teaching designers, and particularly at Saeed University in Dubai. And it really changed the way I looked at things, and I've become very passionate about the notion of design education and why we teach what we teach. And I'm trying to raise the issue of, I suppose, the predominance of modern ideologies in design education. And I think that we can go beyond that, and in particular in places like the UAE and in places like NYU Abu Dhabi and some of the other institutions here, it's actually, I think we're under pressure quite rightly to, I'm going to stand away from that, I can hear it starting to squeal. Tarek, where are you? Tarek, I promise I won't fall over here. Earlier when we were doing, it's good, I'm just telling you, bring the helmet. We were walking around and doing a test, and I fell off the edge here. So I've been promising them that, yeah, I'm going to stay on the stage. I'm not going to walk too much. But, anyways. So I'm going to begin with the first book. It's just sort of, I guess, a trail through my academic career. And this is actually based on my PhD dissertation, I did it at the University of British Columbia, and my specialization is actually Native American art. And so in a way, my academic career has been a little bit schizophrenic. And so people who know of me in Canada know of me because of my work on Aboriginal art, and the people outside of Canada who know me about the Gulf, which is a really sort of strange thing. And sometimes people ask me, you know, like, how is it that you can consolidate these two different areas? And I don't have a quick answer to that, but it's something that I've been thinking about. So the original, the dissertation was republished in 2002, and it's about the political situation of First Nations art in Canada. And so I just sort of wanted to, you know, not everybody knows this, where are we talking about here? So I wanted to just give you a couple of examples. This particular work here is by the totem pole carver that I just wrote a book about. His name was Charlie James. The word Kwakwaka'wak, I know it's a mouthful. It means people who speak Kwakwala. Oh, hi Mark, how are you doing? Nice to see you. It's really, really great to see friendly faces out here. I hope that they remain friendly to the end. So anyways, Northwest Coast is a really interesting place. It has the highest it had the highest density of population in the Americas for any place north of Mexico, and it had the highest densest population. I'm going to blame all my on jet lag, right? Because I've only been here for a day now. Yeah, probably half the audience is in the same boat. Anyways, so Northwest Coast region, it is the Pacific coast of North America, and this is the kind of thing that I was looking at, so you can read it for yourself. So after I finished the dissertation, actually before I finished the dissertation, I came here to the UAE, and I came here because my wife got a job here at the Higher Colleges of Technology, and it just ended up that they opened this new university called, what was it called? American University of Sharjah. So I taught there for 3 years, and then they opened this other university called Zayed University, and I was there for just about 11 years. And one of the things about, you know, when you finish your dissertation, well, I don't know about you guys, but when I finish my dissertation, I don't want to hear any more about it. Don't talk to me about it. I don't want to talk about it. I don't even want to think about it. So it was a really great opportunity to arrive in the UAE and to have a look around and see all this stuff here that I didn't know anything about. I mean, I'd done work in grad school on Islamic art, but talking about Islamic art, or even Islamic architecture, and talking about the architecture of the Gulf are to a certain degree, two different things. So I didn't really feel prepared for this, but one of the things that I got interested in was that as I did more work, I saw the more commonalities with the kind of stuff that I was looking at in BC. So one of the things, there are a couple of things that led from that. The first thing is that when I was at AUS, I organized a conference, and the conference was intended to bring together archaeologists and architects, because they were the two main groups of people in the UAE at the time, and that was, I guess, in 1999, who were looking at material culture. And oftentimes the two groups didn't talk to each other. So we thought it'd be really interesting starting a new design program to bring these two groups together and to talk about them. And through that whole process, I began to meet the archaeologists around here, people like Mark, of course, and Christian Velda, who's the resident archaeologist at the National Museum of Ras Al Khaimah. And it worked out really well for us because, you know, it's like an hour drive from Dubai to Ras Al Khaimah. And when you go up to Ras Al Khaimah, it's a very interesting situation. Because when you think about what is the thing that you really need to live here before oil, what you really need is water. And because of the situation with the environmental zones in the north and this kind of congestion of the land or compression of the land and this closer proximity to the mountains means that the water table was higher, so it's able to support a larger population. And then, of course, Ras Al Khaimah didn't have oil. So what happened is that a lot of that stuff actually, to this day, is still there. And so we began by just simply loading students on the bus and going up there, and Christian would take us through. And you know, after a while, we started to realize that that was good for a while. Students enjoyed being out of the university. That's when I learned the Arabic word for prison, actually. But that's another story. So we used to take them up and do our tour thing. And after a while, the students were, you know, thinking this is predictable. Like Ron, they'd just say, Mr. Ron, wallah, that's enough. Stop taking us to some empty bal somewhere. You know, so it wasn't exactly what people were looking for. So we started to do hands-on exercises, because if you look at the art and design program at Saeed University, it consisted of 3 main parts, and one of the largest parts of that was interior design. So there were students that were already knew a lot about architecture and had a lot of training in it. We just wanted to come up with examples, with things that they could focus on, try this new stuff out, and then at the same time generate information about essentially their homeland. It was a really, really interesting experience. And of course, that opened up a whole Pandora's box of different opportunities, because often when we went to these different villages, we would have students who came from that tribe. And we began to use the digital technology that's common to architectural design these days, and bring in some oral history and kind of bring things together. So that's how I kind of switched over. And one of the things that, for personal reasons, I was really interested in Iran and the relationship between here and Iran. It's a very complex subject, actually. But I started to really think about that, and to really think about the similarities on both sides of the Gulf. And of course, if you spent any time here, you realize that, first of all, the United Arab Emirates is not a homogeneous place, even when you're talking about the Emirati population itself. I mean, this is a group that combines a lot of different tribes who had, and still often maintain, ties with the other side or with the other countries in the region. And that was really interesting. And I really wanted to learn more about that. And I found that there were so few materials available that I thought, oh, what the hell? I'll just go out and write something on it. So I wrote a book called Building on Desert Tides. And that was done with research money through Saeed University. And as part of the process, I traveled around the Gulf. I spent time in pretty much everywhere except for Saudi Arabia. I went to Iran twice. And then I started to bring all this stuff together. I did all the archival research and got archival photographs and produced this book. And this is the book. I actually tried to publish it several different places. I don't know. I actually wanted to publish something that was more of a popular history. You know, I think it was when I first saw the royalty check that I got for my first book. You know, it was really well received critically, but I made a grand total of $249 off of it. I was thinking, I want to write something more popular that people actually read, or even better, buy. So I was looking at all these publishers, mainly in London. We were looking at one in the Emirates, and it just didn't pan out. I was on this conference in Seoul, and the people that were sponsoring it said they're looking for books. So I submitted the manuscript, and they published it in 2002. It's kind of difficult to get. All my design students all hate it. And mainly because of the way it looks. I had one distributor in the UAE, I was trying to set it up, and they wanted to actually take the book, redesign it, and republish it. So we were using it for a textbook for a while, but one of the things that I was dissatisfied was with the level of detail. And so, you know, by the time you begin a book and you finish a book, it's a couple of years, and then it's got to be edited, and it's a super long process, right? So in the meantime, we're continuing to teach it each semester, going out and doing the same thing. And I found that I began to accumulate quite a lot of information. And because the students were unhappy about going out to empty deserts, we started to play around with some different things. So one of the things we would do is we'd go up to a place and photo document it and use a simple handheld GPS locator and just label it all. So I put this all in actually Google Earth, and then I took Lorimer's Gazetteer, which was published in 1907. It's kind of the primary written resource on Emirati social and economic history. And I laid this all in, and then we started going up these places and building these models and trying to input them. So this particular model, I actually learned the process of doing it with my students. Of course, they're much better at it than me, but what I did is I took the photographs that a student took and molded them together into the model. And we started playing around with ideas like this. So it was, slowly accumulating all these materials. And, and then we were doing things like playing with Google Earth. It's a deceptively simple software that I think is really powerful. And I'm still not delved into the depths of it. But I'm looking at these kind of relationships between here and there, and what are the tribal ways in which this is carried, and how are there architectural differences, and what does that all mean? And again, these are really simple software, but I think they're incredibly powerful. And one of the things that was really great when we were at Saeed University is that Google used to come in and work with us. So the students would go through training procedures there. So this is just actually what this fly-through is. It takes you to both sides of the Gulf, to the different villages inhabited by one of the main tribes, the Ali, here in the UAE, and stopping at Al Gawain, and we're just going to go into the interior and look at Falaj al-Mu'alla. Used to be called Falaj al-Ali. I'm just waiting for it to finish now. I mean, it's kind of hypnotizing. It's amazing. It's amazing, I think. I thought it was at the time, anyways, to get access to this kind of satellite imagery. And so then I started working with my design colleagues at ZU, and we started doing a single course that cut across different disciplines. So, for example, we came up with this idea that all of us were going to do something on Jazira Hamra, which is an abandoned kind of trading village in the southern part of Ras Al Khaimah, if you don't know it. Basically, it was left as it stands right now in 1970, 71. And so we started to, take something like that, and I would teach it from one perspective, one of my colleagues would teach it from another perspective, and we then kind of try to draw everything together. And by that time, the people that I was working with started to go off to different universities and get access to different technologies. And we started playing around with technology at a deeper level. At first, it was simply it was fun. We were just reproducing what we were trying to get. And then we started investigating, how can we use full virtual reality as a kind of historic reconstruction? And what kind of information do you get from that? And one of the things that we started to look at were things like using a software out of University College London that helps you analyze the geometry of the place, of the two-dimensional patterning. And for this one, one of the softwares we were using, for example, color codes like this, the residences that are most accessible to the community. It does it by analyzing angles and analyzing thoroughfares, analyzing the space around it. And then what we do is go and talk to people and layer over that kind of ethnographic information. And it started to get really interesting because the overlap between them was so clear. In other words, the geometry of the plan of one of these historic villages embodies the society that produces it. I mean, in one way, that's kind of obvious, but another way, the way in which that works is quite interesting. So, for example, this is actually a town called Jumeirah. It's on another abandoned village from the 70s on the western coast of Qatar. And it's really interesting, and I forgot what I was going to say about it. So it's Jumeirah. So one of the things that happens is the courtyards control people's access, and there are layers, there are levels of that. And there are places that are very, very clearly public and semi-public and very private. And the interesting thing in that was that that's beginning to show up in this kind of analytical software. So that was really interesting, food for thought. And then I left the UAE. I started to continue to work with people who I had worked with here. And one of the things that we were doing is working with This is Calgary, by the way. I just wanted to put this up to make you guys feel better. I know you're complaining about the coolness today. Trust me, it's not cold. I know a lot of you guys know that already. By the way, thank you for bringing me here, NYU Abu Dhabi. I missed a full meter of snow at home last night, so awesome. Can I stay longer? So one of the things that I was really interested in doing was taking these kinds of technologies, because I thought they were leading somewhere, and apply it to other examples of vernacular architecture. And it's still something I want to play with a little bit more. I'm not sure where it's going to lead me. For those of you who have any connection with Saeed University, you might recognize this guy here. His name is Thomas Tucker. He taught at ZU for, I think, 6 years. He's now at Virginia Tech. And he's a great guy to hang out with because he always has toys. And here he is. I was going to make a joke about his balls, but I'm not going to. Here he is setting up a Faro 3D scanner. So what we did is we went out to a teepee on the Blackfoot Reservation and scanned it three-dimensionally. And from that, we created a model. It just so happened, this is some information on the Blackfoot, in case you don't know who they are. It's an Aboriginal nation in Alberta. And one of the things we're doing is, again, we're using the model that was so successful at ZU is working with students. And one of the students, a very good friend of mine now, his name is Richard. He's got the best name ever. Best name ever. You'll go home tonight and remember it. I'm sure you will. His name is Richard Duck Chief Running Rabbit. That's an awesome name. This is his great-grandfather. And a teepee isn't just a structure. It also has spiritual and ancestral information embedded in it. And usually the covers are actually painted according to the vision of one of the ancestors. And then that is carefully controlled through spiritual protocol and passed very carefully from hand to hand, from generation to generation. And Richard, who was one of my students at the Alberta College of Art and Design, had the rights to one of the teepees. So what we did is we worked with him, we did the 3D scan, and we created here, let's go, come on. We created some augmented reality apps. So this is something I really would like to do, and come back here in the Emirates and play around with it. So that's the three-dimensional model. You could view this, if I had everything set up for you, you can view this through your phone. And because phones now all have GPS locators, what we can do is set it up so it triggers whatever information you get. The way we did it here is we had the little teepee set up. And so this is the view that you would see through the phone. And then we had icons going around, and you press the icons, and you get a recorded explanation of Richard's family teepee. Anyways, Calgary didn't work very well, and so I moved, threw the dogs in the back of the truck, and drove across the country from Calgary in the west to Prince Edward Island in the east. It took 7 days. And if you guys know my wife, you know that 7 days is a long day because a long week, because my wife has a really heavy foot and she won't ever let me drive. So it was 7 days of me screaming and her going 220 kilometers an hour. It still took a week. You guys aren't taking me seriously, right? It did take a week, but she wasn't driving that fast all the time. So anyways, this is my new house. And one of the things that I've become really interested in is taking the same toolkit and applying it to this location particularly. It's of great historic significance in Canada. So, I know it sounds like I'm sort of all over the place. Come on, let's move on. So, sorry. So one of the things that I've been doing in the meantime, so what happened is that I had this vast amount of resources accumulated from my time in the Emirates, and it was expanding the technologies that we're using, but I didn't have enough time to catch up to it. And that was actually one of the reasons why I left my position, because I wanted to focus on doing this stuff. Now, I've been started blogging. I've had the thing for about 5 or 6 years, but I used to do it to, just to keep people updated on what we were doing with their students and stuff. And I thought, let's do something different. Let's refocus and do it specifically on the Emirates. And this will give me a chance to sort through all the materials that I have and begin to bring it out piece by piece by piece. And so essentially what I've been doing publicly is writing a book online. And it's not got to the point where everything is brought together, but what I'm really hoping to do is to launch an electronic press specializing in e-publications. So what we can do then is bring all these materials together into one cohesive, interactive and dynamic exploration of historic architecture in the Gulf. So that's one of the things that I'll be doing in the next little while. I have a couple of projects that I think are really interesting, I think that people are really interested in. So I want to sort of try and make more than $250 this time around and publish it directly. So this is why I've been blogging, and like I said, it's a way of me combing through and getting the materials, starting to map it out, and to think about what are the kinds of different things that we want to integrate. And at the same time, again, taking these kinds of ideas in experimenting, I've been branching out. So doing the stuff in Eastern Canada with colonial architecture, doing stuff on the prairies in North America with teepees, doing the stuff that I did with the Northwest Coast. At one time in the future, I hope to bring it all together. And so one of the things that I've been doing in order to push forward the exploration of virtual reality is working on Japanese topics. And essentially what happened is when we started doing the virtual reality stuff, a company in Tokyo contacted me and asked me to be part of this group of 8 scholars. We then doubled it to 16 scholars from universities around the world. And for the longest time, I was doing just UAE stuff. And then I decided to change over and do some Japanese stuff. So I've got a second blog going, and it's based on a Japanese woodblock printer who was active in the first half of the 1800s. And he did this one particular album that consists of 55 prints, beginning the end in 53 stations along, that's why it's called 53 stations, the blog is. It's each station along this highly organized, formalized route in Japan. It's still one of the main highways there. We're looking at bringing the GPS material together and also the CAD software stuff. So I started just playing around with that by looking at other examples of vernacular architecture. I love this house. It's a ferryman's house. And what I really like about it is that when you're finished work, you can carry it home. So anyway, so we're just sort of the same kind of thing. And then I thought, well, let's actually try something a little bit more different. And let's actually take the prints themselves and integrate them into this kind of virtual world. And it's still early days. One of the cool things that when I get access to the software is it also does weather simulation. So we can show what it's like to be in Prince Edward Island when 1 meter of snow falls in. So when you look at all this stuff, it's all over the place, I know. It's all over the place spatially, but chronologically, they're all kind of related. And really what I'm looking at, I was looking at, I'll finish the explanation. So I just wanted to sort of place the books within this. So the first book I wrote was from 1921 to 1961, but in order to understand that period of Canadian history, you gotta go back 100 years. You really have to understand what is the process of the foundation of the country and what is the process of colonization and how has that affected people. And then the totem pole carver that I just finished the book on, he lived 1867 to 1937, so it's starting to see a ballpark here. And then I'm really, in order to understand this whole thing, you got to go back to when Europeans first arrived. And in that part of Canada, that was in the 1760s and began to accelerate through the 1780s and 90s. And then I realized when I looked at what I was doing with the golf book is that this is in exactly the same period. And the reason why there are some patterns that are very similar between somewhere like the UAE and Aboriginal Canada, even though it's spatially so distanced from each other, is that they're both subject to the process of British imperialism at different kinds of status within the British Empire, but they're both deeply affected. And this period, between 1799 and let's say 1961, it really is a fluorescence of the British Empire, this amazing expansion of influence around the world, and then its contraction and decolonization. So even the Japanese stuff actually fits in that. So I was thinking, like how do we bring this all together, and what are the kinds of issues that are raised by this? We add the kind of new stuff that I'm doing. And I started to think about this in terms of design education. And I started again to think about, time. And it struck me that the same time that totem pole up there on the left was being carved, that TP cover was being painted, it's all in the early part of the 20th century. And when we talk about design, what we're really talking about often in design history is modern Western design. And so this is an image of a kind of prototypical house that was constructed according to the designs of a famous Swiss architect named Le Corbusier. If you're a design person at all, oh, Le Corbusier, we all know Le Corbusier. And I was thinking, a lot of the stuff that I'm looking at in the UAE also comes from this exact same period. So then in terms of design education, and I think this is particularly relevant to the Gulf, why is it that we teach Le Corbusier and not a house in Khorfakan? And there's all sorts of reasons. As I go through that, I'm just going to put up a couple of slides that you can read if you're still awake. And so when we talk about Le Corbusier is one of the real most important members of the famous group of 20th century architects. And he was looking at a number of different things. And one of the things about his architectural design is that he wanted it to be cost effective, and he wanted it to be highly flexible. I have to have more water. I forget how thirsty you get here. So Le Corbusier uses a form of architecture that's based on modules. Modules can be put together in different ways, so there's a kind of flexibility of the design system. He actually studied vernacular architecture from the Mediterranean, and he tried to utilize some of their ideas. And he did things like creating curtain walls on the inside that could be changed around, different kinds of window dressing that could be shifted around depending on what the site features are, and things like this. The other thing that he was really interested in is creating a form of architecture that is that you can mass produce. And that's really why he's so important. I mean, the way in which houses are constructed today are really derived from some of the ideas that Le Corbusier championed. Okay, so you look at this stuff. It's simple geometry. And what's the difference, therefore? I want to skip through this. What's the difference then between that and the Courtyard House? My students here have said often that there's a kind of equation of the past with poverty, right? Anything before oil, it was tough living here. Let's face it, when it's 52 degrees Celsius and you're living off of water that was accumulated from winter rains, it's a difficult place to live. And that's actually one of the things that I thought was really interesting. And it sort of stems back to my time at AUS. And there's this, by the way, the vibe at AUS when it first opened up was wonderful. It actually reminds me a lot of NYU. And that's actually a really good thing. The architecture here, I think, is much better designed. And that seems to me that it does play a significant role in the interaction of the different communities of the university, and the idea that it's self-contained, and yet you have so many people from different backgrounds here, that's really interesting. AUS isn't designed as well. And one of the things about, if you haven't been to AUS, when I first went there, I was like, holy moly, I want to be in a university in the Gulf. Because when they first opened that, the scale, the space, the materials, it's like this gleaming jewel in the middle of the desert. And at the time, it was really in the middle of the desert. It wasn't part of the suburb like it is now. I mean, I remember the first time I went out to see the AUS, there were no roads to it. You had to take a dirt track, and I'd pull over and, this is a university, everybody knows this. I'd pull over and ask somebody at the gas station. Where is this university? And they're all like, what are you talking about? You get there, and it's this incredible, iconic, beautiful set of buildings. And of course, it's part with HCT and Sharjah University and all that at the same time. So in May, I began to change my mind about how much I appreciated the architecture at AUS. And it's because they switched my exam room to the opposite side of the campus from where I was teaching. And in those days, I wasn't using the computer hardly at all. We were just using the old, Kodak slide projector. So there I was with my little, it's 11 in the morning, mid-May. I got this little cart, and it dressed, I think I actually even wore a tie. Don't tell anybody, but I think I actually wore a tie. And I hate ties, they burn. Anyways, so I'm going across, and all I can think is, oh my God, can I make it? Because it's about 100 meters from one side to the other. And everything is polished stone. And this is, blaring back in my eyes. I can't see, I can't breathe because it's so hot. And by the time I get into the exam room, I was soaked in sweat. I was thinking, I felt like God was following me with, like little kids do it with ants, with a magnifying glass and burning my sorry so-and-so. And I was thinking, this is what happens when you get somebody raised on Le Corbusier, somebody whose background and way of thinking about architecture is derived from Western prototypes in a climate that they're not used to. You look at the LEEDs, environmental controls for new buildings. Those are for Northern Hemisphere. Those are for Europe. They're not for here. And I think this is where this idea of turning away from this stuff to the vernacular architecture and understanding becomes really important. So I thought, like today, in order to go through this, we'll take some of the processes that we were looking at, I was outlining for you before, and put them in place in a very small kind of, not a small, but a very specific category or type of architecture here. And I want to look at the Courtyard House. And there are a million of these around here. Talk about flexibility. They're all over the place. They're still around. And basically, they consist of a square or rectangular courtyard with residential units within that. And you can see it in masonry, you can see it in the mountains in stone, and you don't see it very much anymore, but it was also done in Arish, in fact, or palm front. So in fact, Arish was the main building material here. And I think this is another thing, right? When you go to modern construction techniques, we want to use modern materials. And I always tell my students, like, if you think concrete's a wonderful thing, just put your hand on the wall in either summer or winter and see what happens. You can feel the heat radiating in the summer, and you can feel the cold. So the situation is, in these really beautiful buildings, houses all over the Emirates, because we're using these kinds of construction materials, you have to have an electronic mechanical system of cooling the house. So what do you do when you don't have that? And why not, especially since the price of oil ain't what it used to be, why not think about going back to some of this stuff and integrating it into the classroom so people can use that as the point of departure? And of course, the overwhelming response to that is, we don't know. And one of the things that's been really interesting about writing the blog is people contact me all the time, or if we have some sort of discussion, we're always talking about where are the resources, how do we get the resources? And I guess in a way it's a young discourse. I've talked to a number of people. When I first started writing about this stuff, I was really shy. I didn't want to tell anybody, I'll tell you about my native stuff because I was comfortable with it. I didn't want to tell anybody that I wasn't trained in this stuff, right? And then I found out, that all my archaeologists and architect friends, well, you're not trained in this stuff either. And so I think this is a really important time in the historiography of this country. Because now, with these universities, you're getting people who are living here for a prolonged time from elsewhere, who are turning their attention to what they see before them. And at the same time, you have this young generation of Emirati scholars who are going through the process of kind of not just rediscovering, but exploring the richness of their own history from the perspective of their family. And I think this is really going to make something special over the long run. So anyways, here's a stone one. And I wanted to be very distinct about this as compared to this type of architecture. This type of architecture is undoubtedly the best known. This is a wind tower house. It's actually the Sheikh Saeed house. Sheikh Saeed Al Maktoum in Shendaga in Dubai. And this form of architecture is actually an import from southern Iran. And it is more or less associated with very specific tribal groups, some of who were originally Arab but lived over in Iran and then came back. So this is not the kind of architecture that I want to talk about today. This is a very specialized architecture. In fact, I compare this architecture with the kind of house that I'm living in. It was built approximately at the same time. They're using standardized materials, standardized sizes, and a lot of imported elements. There's a very famous example of one of these wind tower houses in Dubai that had imported German glass and Italian Corinthian columns. So this architecture is fascinating, but it's fascinating from the perspective of globalization. How does it affect what we make and where we live? So I really wanted to be distinct about that and say, no, I don't want to look at that. I want to look at something that's indigenous and that's vernacular in the true sense of the word. Because when you're talking about vernacular, we're really talking about houses that we used to make ourselves. We don't do that anymore. We get professionals to do it. And I think the wind tower house is a really great example of this burgeoning professional trade that supplied their goods around the Gulf. So then I wanted to just sort of raise some issues for you. Like, again, we're pretending that this is a kind of design classroom right now. And so let's think about what are the things that the designers had to think about. And of course, the biggest thing here is the climate. So that's the first challenge to building architecture here. How do you deal with temperatures that can go up easily to 52 degrees Celsius? Or 48 degrees Celsius in the summertime. The other thing is there's no rivers here. So you have to be really inventive in how you collect that water, and it's a really big issue. So that also impacts where people build, obviously. And then the third thing is that you have limited building materials. So these Emirati self-taught architects came up with a number of really interesting solutions to each one of these challenges. And the first one is when you talk about the climate here, they use passive cooling strategies. And simply what that means is that you integrate ways in which you harness the immaterial conditions of the site that you build in to get your house cooler. So you think about the wind tower house, the most famous thing, of course, is the wind tower. The wind tower is at a higher altitude than anywhere else, where the wind runs at a higher speed and is then forced down into the internal space, creating a vacuum that sucks up the hot air. The really effective way of doing things. If you ever stood under one of these things, it's quite actually remarkable how well they work. So that's one of the things that I think is really interesting. I'm using the example of wind. I'm going to extend that to also the sun, because really the other thing about those temperatures is the sun and the effect of the sun on somebody. And that is one of the immaterial conditions of the site that people have to think about. One of the things that they did all the time is they're very careful about how they oriented the buildings. And I'll show you some examples of that in a second. And then when we go to some of these other challenges, use of groundwater, for sure, that's a common thing. But one of the other really inventive things that was done here was to create very innovative and quite complex ways of capturing water during the winter and directing it into storage cisterns that you could then use throughout the year. And I'm not going to talk about that in any kind of detail because I'm focusing specifically on the house. But it is a whole sort of area to be explored in itself. And then the idea of the materials, that's one of the things about the place is that very interesting in how local materials were used. And again, apart from concrete, right? And if you've been into a mud brick building in the summertime, It's surprising how much cooler it is. And one of the things that we did with that Qatar project that I was looking at, and those are very similar kinds of houses, is we created the model of the village, and then we started using this software that analyzes the performance of the building and internal temperatures and things like this. And one of the things that we found when we did the simulation is that the materials that they use, the local materials, and the way in which they put it together creates this stable envelope. And it's not so much that it's cooler, but it releases the coolness inside very slowly because of the thermal insulation properties of the building. So you have a stable, and it's always dark, so you're shielded from the sun. And then one of the things that they did is they put in, I think it's called dachiya in Arabic. In Farsi, they call it badkesh. And basically all it is a channel or a small opening into the house. And what that does is allows the penetration of cooling air. When we did the simulation, and there's some question about how accurate it is, we're still not completely convinced, but it's promising. It lowers the temperature by 5 degrees Celsius. And you think it's the summertime when it's 52 degrees Celsius, I'd much rather have it 47. I mean, the 5 degrees difference can really make a difference in how you live. And of course, the other thing that's actually problematic in terms of how they're used is the internal spaces were quite small. And I'm sure if we talk to one of the senior administrators here, we talk about this beautiful space out here. I cannot imagine how much it must cost in the summertime to keep this building cool. And so that's one of the reasons why the scale is so reduced. This is not about poverty, it's about common sense. And it's much easier to keep that internal temperature lower when you do that. So there are other things that I think are really interesting as well. And there are certain social, I wouldn't say challenges, although written challenges, I think, social concerns, let's say. And one of the things is this religious requirement for gender segregation. And another is tribal affiliation. And because that's the way in which the economy was organized, it's through the tribe. It's one of the reasons why it continues to be such an important thing here. And then the other aspect of it is that people often move from site to site. So what you want to do is to build either something that's portable that you can pack up and carry with you, or you want something that's small that you can leave in place and you don't have to worry about. So again, the kind of scale that people used to build here in the period immediately preceding oil, it's all about this kind of integrated, very intimate relationship with the site in which it's located. This is something that architects talk about all the time, but it's quite another thing to actually utilize that. And so what are the kinds of issues that are related to this, or what are the solutions? So really, when you look at not only the house as an individual unit, but the house as part of a complex of units of people that are related to you, one of the things that you do is create these spaces that are hierarchical in terms of accessibility. So I'll give you some more specific examples of that. But these are actually enshrined in Islamic law. So one of the things that's very common with these houses is that they're all the same height. And that's so that you cannot look into and violate the privacy of the people that are living behind those walls. And the other thing that they often did, the other thing they did in terms of like the interaction between these different units is you would never look from your house into the courtyard of another house. It just doesn't happen. And so these are really small things that they're doing, but they're really effective. And I think that's the point of coming back and comparing it with Le Corbusier. One of the things about Le Corbusier is that he created this kind of list. He had actually 7 points that he always followed. And they're all about simplicity and flexibility. And this is what we're getting here. The other thing about that tribal affiliation, and it comes back to the relationship between a single house unit and the other house units, is that everything is laid out in what used to be called farij, right? So people used to live in a neighborhood with their extended family. And you still, if you talk to older Emirati people today, I'm sure they really miss that. Well, they always talk about it. You know, for example, the security of your children. You didn't have to worry about them playing in the street because you knew everybody in the community. And as soon as somebody from outside of the community comes in, everybody knows about it. It's actually very much like Prince Edward Island. It's exactly the same. When I first moved there, one of my neighbors told me that he'd been living in the same house for about 40 years. He said even if he had to, he couldn't find where his keys were. And that's because everybody in the community knows. And it's exactly like the Farij. And then I just wanted to show you some other images. These are actually images that I took from Fujairah. I was kind of into this whole panoramic thing. If you haven't been, you should go. This is a little model. I wanted to talk a little bit more about this idea of, you know, using the materials and what does it look like inside of it. And what are the kinds of things that we see here? I actually have it labeled out. I'll show you in just a second. So this is what we get. Typically, we have a kind of rubble core that's then plastered over, and the floors are plastered as well. They don't have a foundation, so it's almost like, well, it is. It's like little boxes that you simply place in the sand. And you have usually a washroom, and then a sleeping room, and then there are layers over it. One of the, especially when you get into the 20th century, one of the real common imported materials, really important material here, actually were the mangrove beams, chandlewood, they used to call it. And those sources are mainly from East Africa. There was a very active sea trade back and forth, and if you're interested in things like that, there's a book that was published in the 1930s by an Australian sailor named Alan Villiers. And he actually travels on a Kuwaiti ship and records the whole thing with photographs and explanations, going south of Zanzibar, actually, to pick up a load of this chandlewood, these mangrove beams, and bring them back. They didn't use local mangrove beams because we can look out the window right here and we can see mangrove. But this stuff is a lot different. And for one, it's straighter, and that's why they used it. You could use it in standardized sets. So again, you know, there's a lot of thinking going on in terms of what are the components or elements that we need. And the other thing about it, I mean, of course, there's lots of palm, but palm's not a good wood to build with because it's really soft. And one of the things that every preservation person here in this country can tell you about is that it's awful for insects, and the insects eat it out and it collapses. So this is another thing about these buildings, is that it could be refurbished constantly. Somebody once told me that they had a lifespan of about 80 years if you kept care of it. Well, that's actually not bad. Okay, so these are the kind of construction bits that go together. But the way in which this works in terms of the courtyard is really interesting as well. This is another kind of variation on it, and there's a couple of things going on. I talk about the shadow casting that's going on now. What you can see is during the day, the way in which the units or the residential units are placed extends the shadow into the courtyard and it opens up a usable space. It's really simple, and I think it's actually brilliant. And then this particular model I built, it's got a couple of different things thrown in. One of the things that's really typical is a family would start with one single unit and then expand. And you simply just build a second house or a second unit, and the son and the daughter-in-law can move in, and so on and so forth. And then the other thing that happens is, of course, you can create and it's still, of course, a very important institution here in the Emirates, is create the majlis. So a semi-public space that's used by the men outside of that consecrated, not consecrated, that kind of controlled space, private space. And then a third thing that happens quite often, this is a little model that I was based on Jazira al-Hamra, is they stagger the entrance. So what happens is that, okay, first of all, if you look at this one, you want to go and see the guy who lives here, you can go in the mattress to sit down with him. If you're walking down the street, as you pass, if you happen to look to the right, you don't see into the courtyard itself. So it's a really simple intervention, but effective. And what's so important about it is that it's so tuned to the way people lived here, and those important social norms of gender segregation. Okay, I'm getting confused between here and there. The other thing about the courtyard itself, one of the things that you see is that there's not really a set proportions. They can be used differently. In order to just sort of demonstrate the relationship between the site, what I did is I took a satellite image of the Shimel area in Ras Al Khaimah. This is a farming area, but they were using essentially the same thing. What they did is they expanded the courtyard so that it would hold a date orchard, essentially. And what you can see is that's expanded, and then there's quite a lot of difference in how it fits in. It's almost like a jigsaw. And the reason for that is access to water. So what happens during the winter is the water collects in the wadi itself and then flows out. And every year it's the same thing. And you go anywhere in the plains, just out from the coast, and you see these ruts. Those ruts are from the rains flowing through over and over and over again. And so what they're doing with this is they're building according to those ruts, and then when the seasonal availability of water comes in, they simply direct it into the courtyard itself. And they're stored in a cistern and then release it throughout the year. Again, a really simple intervention, but effective. So this is one last one, and what I was trying to do here is just show the relationship between the two of them. I used the satellite imagery, this is from Khorfakan actually, just to sort of look at it, and I have not managed to build an accurate model yet based on the photographs that I took. It's a lot of work to actually align them up. And I was realizing that a lot of the structures that I was, particularly in the bottom, when you look at the shadow casting, have to be much later. It's a mixed community. You also see quite a lot of difference seasonally between how the shadows work. And so that also impacts which environment are you living in at what time of year. And again, this kind of orientation towards the immaterial. So I'm just going to sort of sum up. The Courtyard House is based on a simple, flexible design. And the concept is of delineated private, family, and then public spaces through the use of both the courtyard and the residential blocks. So the house is a stable envelope made with local materials, often with high insulation properties that keeps the internal temperature constant. The use of ventilation holes to lower that temperature is up to 5 degrees. And then the blocks are placed in consideration to seasonal site characteristics, especially the movement of the sun and the wind. And then the residential space, that, again, that flexibility that Le Corbusier was really interested in, is simply, the space is simply increased by adding another layer or another unit. And then the courtyard itself, I think anybody from the West has this kind of 19th century picturesque approach to their garden. Garden has to look beautiful. Courtyard has to have plants. You have a much more functional approach here. Because really, when you think about it, the courtyard is the single functioning space for the family as a unit. And then those units, furthermore, have a relationship to that courtyard through the use of shadow casting, which again, I think is really interesting. And then the relationship between this, between the different house complexes, is based on established concepts enshrined in Islamic law. And I actually talked to some older people in different communities, and they're saying, of course, people here used to follow different schools of Islamic jurisprudence and legal thought, but essentially when it comes to constructing the house, there's not a lot of difference between them, so they all follow these kinds of principles. And then the use of the walls, the height of the walls, to protect those gendered spaces, and so forth and so forth. Now, one of the things that, you know, I think most people would say is that I don't care how good it is, I ain't moving in. Nobody really wants to live in these small kind of spaces. Although I have to say that the tiny house is getting this big push in North America right now. Maybe it'll come here eventually. I doubt it, but anyways. So, you know, my point really isn't that let's all go and live in Emirati houses because, old school Emirati houses, because they're more environmentally friendly. It's not that. It's about using this as a form of design education that exposes students to these principles that can then be a kind of departure point. So really you're teaching systems that are similar in concept to what you would with the prototypical example of Le Corbusier, but you're using a local example. And I think that's really important. I remember one time, the first time we started to bring in resident artists to speak to our students, we had this colleague who was Qatari, and he came in and did his thing, and the students were, they thanked him. They said, we'd never have an example of somebody in the Kandura coming in and talking to us about our stuff. And I think that's an important thing to consider. And I would argue that in all those different places that I've been talking about, whether it be Japan or Siksika land in Alberta, people want that example. They want their work to be, or the work of their ancestors to be appreciated and explored. So I was thinking, okay, well, let's just play around with a couple of examples just to end things up of what might be possible. And the first thing I thought of, and is an interesting example, we see the architects, they picked this one up. I thought this would be a cool idea. This is Moshe Safdie, is Israeli-Canadian architect. It's a residential complex built in 1967 for the World Exposition that was held in Montreal. So I know I'm not saying everybody do this, but again, essentially we're talking about these kinds of units that are being put together. I mean, just because we're talking about these conditions, it doesn't mean they have to be replaced in it. It's kind of departure point. And then as a final way of thinking, well, maybe they might look like this. Okay, so yesterday I arrived, right? All of you are looking at me like, what the hell is he on about? This is student work here from NYU. And yesterday I arrived thinking it was Sunday and trying to meet NYUAD, who's having a day off. So I'm like, oh, wow, what am I going to do? So I wandered around the campus and took a couple of pictures. It's very interesting that the notion of vernacular architecture is being explored here. And I just wanted to finish with a quote. This is, if you guys don't have this book and you're interested in Emirati stuff, this is the book to have. It's actually quite an extraordinary work. It's very old school ethnography. It's done by William and Fidelity Lancaster. And what they did is they lived during the winters up in Ras Al Khaimah for something like 6 years and went out and just talked to people about it. And I thought there was this really interesting quote to finish it off. And the reason why I think this is interesting, sorry, let me find it here, is that it kind of contradicts what the external kind of popular stereotypic perception of Emirati people are. And I think this is really interesting how he puts it. So as Muslims, the people of this area, meaning the UAE, are part of the Abrahamic tradition and accept the creation of the world by Allah for men to live from and therefore to take care of and to be content with. Many stressed mutualities. One mutuality was made between mountains, the associated dews, rains, rocks, stones, soils, and trees with goats, camels, crops, bees, and people. Another was made between mountains whose foothills extend under the sea and rains with sea fishing and pearling. That's actually a really interesting example. When we think about heritage landscapes, we tend to fixate on terrestrial things. But people here had this notion of ownership of the waters and would often create artificial reefs in order to enhance fishing sites. So this is something to think about. We should maybe extend some of these things to include the sea. These mutualities were seen as manifestations of God's generosity and mercy, not only for people, but for all his creation. These mutualities are mediated by ownership and work that enable people to live and provide protection and care to develop features of the natural world, and further mediated by trimal premises and processes that require coordination of livelihood activities by the participants. Ownership of natural features such as basins of soil, springs, and seeps of water, trees, or underwater mounds by development and transmission by inheritance or purchase assumes obligations to protect and conserve for future generations as well as present rights to use. Thank you. I can hear you.
Did you do much visits to Oman? Their housing compared to here?
Yeah, there are some substantial differences. The question, if you haven't heard it, was have I been to Oman? I've been to Oman 3 or 4 times, and I spent a week as part of the book just going out and documenting, visiting places. And some of the same principles, but put together in a different way. And I was really interested in it, more like a tower house that's quite common, with a very small inner courtyard. The units are organized much like the wind tower houses around the periphery, but the height of the building and the closeness of that courtyard creates not only shadow on the inside, but enhances the movement of wind. I thought that was really fascinating. I was in one house I can't remember where it was now, a very old house. The family let me come in and have a snoop. And it was really hot. I think they just felt sorry for me. I was just amazed at how comfortable it was. Yeah, and this is the thing, right? You know, when we're talking about dependence on electricity and oil, I mean, it's not that we're going to go back to this stuff, but certainly by doing this, we enhance our abilities, you know?
I wanted you to talk a little bit more maybe about this question of mobility when it comes to architecture. I was just reading Karsten Niebuhr's travels, and one of the points that he makes is that it's very difficult for there to be centralized imperial control in the Gulf, especially over the Arabs that he's describing, because whenever, for example, Persia wanted to come and control a bandar or a cove or a community, they could just simply get up and leave and take their things.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that valuable, so they could just leave it or move to another cove and avoid that sort of situation. So what does this architecture do, not only in terms of mobility, but in terms of its political implications?
I mean, there are 2 aspects to it. On one hand, we're talking about military tactics, which is really interesting as well. You read the 18th century discussions of it, right? The British would come in, especially before they did the 1819 campaign, 1819-20 campaign. It was very ineffective, because simply everybody, like you say, went off to another cove, and they couldn't find them. And I found it really interesting that if you go to Daya, up in Ras Al Khaimah, which is one of the entry points for the invasion of the 1819 campaign, is people all sort of retreated into the Date Gardens where there's a citadel, and sat there and watched, I imagine, the British and their sepoy soldiers pulling these heavy guns across marshy land. And then, you know, once they got close, they could just take off. There's a whole village up in the mountains behind that you just can't see. And it's kind of about, it's kind of related to how British colonialism actually occurred here, because they controlled the coast. And they talk about it all the time. All the agents talked about it. Well, yeah, we control the coast, but we don't know what's going on in the interior. And that's one of the things that happens. That seasonal movement is also about, of course, resource exploitation and the seasonal availability of that. I mean, I love Frog Herd Bay's wonderful term, the versatile tribesman, as an explanation of that. And you can really see that with the tribes that were moving across the mountains, you know, because you have these stable buildings, you just leave them, you know, lock it up if you want, and then go over to your place on the other side. So in terms of, you know, greater social implications of that as well, I think it's in the best interest of any state to encourage a more sedentary habitation pattern, because it is it is easier to control people when you know where they are. I can hear you. I'll repeat.
Have you been to Masdar City?
Masdar City. We were just talking about that before I came in. No, I've heard about it lots. I simply haven't had the opportunity to go. I want to see that giant wind tower they have. Have you seen it?
Yeah, I'm studying.
Does it work?
Yeah.
The wind tower? I just think it's such a big space. I've only seen the external photographs, or some of the photographs. My students, I had some students who were actually working there, and they were talking about it. So it's an interesting idea. I don't see it as following some of the principles that I've been talking about as closely. What do you think?
Well, it's especially I think the shadow casting, which you're talking about. Well, that's quite
Pronounced?
there's
Oh, right. Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, like in the summer, you can still walk outside.
Right. Yeah. It's not like AUS.
Thank you for mentioning the sea and seascapes, because it's really important not to forget that. As you know, I work mainly in the western region of Abu Dhabi, on the coast and the islands. And what's interesting, talking about the time period you're talking about, like you said, the British colonial had not really knowledge of the interior, but of the coast. And the British Navy, as you know, in 1820s, 30s, was mapping the western region coast, and the islands were called East India Company Islands, Marawa and Abu al-Abyad, that tells you something about their opinion, on the area. And as you know, and Abu Dhabi is just described as a town made out of date mats.
There was a great description of Dubai from like 1840, where, what does he call it? He was comparing it with a really old, what are they called now? It's an old style of architecture that you see up in Scotland, up in the Orkney Islands before. I can't remember what it's called.
Anyway, I just wanted to make two quick points. One point is about the Western region, that an invisible layer that's invisible to many of us today, but it does exist in the Abu Dhabi government GIS system, territorial rights. So from some of the villages, for example, on Marawa Island, there are still ancestral fishing and pearling rights. And it's very interesting because people have a strip of land projecting out from their courtyard houses on the island, going out, and in how it's measured, the portion of the sea goes as far as the depth to which you can dive for pearls. So it includes very large, wide strips, and these are in the government GIS system, because some of these families, who are largely Al Rumaythat, the fishing people of the coast, they have ancestral rights on that. So that was just the first point, is that you don't forget the sea and the land, because some of these tribal and individual rights encompass courtyard houses and the strip of sea to a certain depth, which is very interesting, because a lot of the pearling, unlike the romantic picture of people diving, off the pearl diving boats, in actual fact, quite a lot of pearling, we know, was done just by wading into the sea there, and done by women as well, which is, and the fact of women collecting pearls is something hidden, because we have a rather stereotyped view of guys doing the macho kind of, diving kind of thing, which is, of course, that happened, but it negates the role of women and children and other people in collecting pearls in these very shallow waters in Western region. Just one other quick point. Talking about Dubai and things, one of the things I'm really unhappy about at the moment is Dubai renaming historical areas. And
you mean Al Fahidi neighborhood?
Yes, so Bastakia, we can't call it Bastakia anymore. It's called Al Fahidiyah, after the Fahidi fort. And it's ridiculous, because everyone has known it as Bastakia for many years. And just because Bastak happens to be in Iran, it doesn't mean we have to have historical revision of original place names that appear on old maps and photographs and documents and books and things, and so it's something we should watch out for. And thank you very much for your blog site. I've been looking on it, and it's very important that we preserve this digitally, these things, because then people can contribute from outside.
And I actually hope that that idea of contribution will expand in the future, for sure.
Thanks for a fantastic talk.
Thank you.
I have just one question. There's a lot of ecological diversity within the Gulf, and I'm wondering to what extent that impacted on. I mean, you've talked a bit about the different materials, but also about the design of houses
and site conditions.
Or other
I mean, that's one of the things you have to consider, right? I was watching you. Tarek, at least I didn't fall off. Yeah, it's really interesting. That's why I got very interested in using the satellite imagery, because that demonstrates it quite effectively. And then you can start, once you zoom out, you start to see the interaction, but spatially makes a lot more sense than when you drive through it. It's quite something. And I think that notion of materiality, it's something that artists and architects talk about a lot. And I think embracing the idea of using non-traditional materials is, I don't see why we don't explore that a little bit more.